I never planned to tell anyone this. For years, I convinced myself that silence was the responsible choice. Nothing dramatic happened. No single moment to point at. Just a truth I learned how to carry quietly. Every day, I told myself I was protecting us. Every night, I wondered if I was just protecting myself. The hardest part wasn't keeping the secret. It was living with what it slowly changed in me. I'm a woman in my early 30s, in a long-term relationship that looks stable from the outside. We share routines, responsibilities, and a life that feels familiar and safe. This isn't a story about me looking for attention, excitement, or escape. At the time, I genuinely believed I was doing the mature thing. I told myself that some truths only cause damage, and that love sometimes means choosing silence. But the longer I kept it to myself, the heavier it became. Not because of what happened, but because of what I allowed to remain unspoken. Now I'm left questioning whether silence protected us, or slowly pulled us apart. What I need right now is perspective. If you've ever faced a choice between honesty and protection, I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you're interested in real, thoughtful stories about relationships and moral dilemmas, consider subscribing and sharing this with someone who might relate. I didn't wake up one day and decide to keep a secret. It happened much more quietly than that. At first, it felt unnecessary to say anything. It wasn't a lie, just something I didn't bring up. There was no urgency, no moment where honesty felt required. So I told myself I'd mention it later, when it made more sense, when it wouldn't sound strange or create questions I didn't know how to answer. Days passed, then weeks. The longer I waited, the harder it became to find the right moment. Every time we talked about our future, about trust, about how open we were with each other, I felt a small tension in my chest. Not panic, not fear, just a quiet awareness that there was something sitting between us, even if only I could see it. What made it worse was how normal everything else felt. We laughed. We planned things. We had conversations that felt honest and real. And each time, I told myself that bringing it up would only complicate something that was otherwise good. I wasn't hiding it because I wanted to deceive him. I was hiding it because I didn't know how to explain why it mattered, or whether it actually did. In my mind, silence started to feel like the responsible option, like a form of protection. But slowly, something shifted. I became more careful with my words, more aware of what I shared and how I shared it. Not because he was suspicious, but because I was suspicious of myself and of how easily I was justifying not being fully transparent. There were moments when I almost said it. Small pauses in conversation where I could have brought it up naturally. And every time, I chose not to. Not because I was afraid of losing him, but because I was afraid of changing how he saw me. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about the secret anymore. It was about the version of myself I was quietly maintaining. Was I protecting our relationship? Or was I already crossing a line by deciding alone what he didn't need to know? What would you have done in my place? At some point, the secret stopped feeling like something external. It wasn't just a detail I hadn't shared anymore. It became part of how I moved through the relationship. I started noticing small changes in myself before I noticed them in him. I'd hesitate before answering simple questions, not because the answers were wrong, but because I was measuring them, adjusting them, making sure nothing accidentally led back to what I hadn't said. That was the part that unsettled me the most. I wasn't lying, but I also wasn't being fully honest. And there's a strange space between those two things that's easy to fall into and hard to recognize while you're in it. There were nights when we sat together in silence, both on our phones, both relaxed, both comfortable. And I remember thinking how unfair it felt that he was so at ease, while I was quietly managing something he didn't even know existed, not because he had done anything wrong, but because I had decided, on my own, that this truth wasn't his to carry. I told myself I was sparing him unnecessary worry, that bringing it up would only plant doubts that didn't need to exist, that love wasn't about sharing everything, just the things that mattered. But that's when the questions started creeping in. Who decides what matters? Who gets to choose which truths are harmless enough to keep hidden? And at what point does protection turn into control? I noticed how careful I became with timing, how I avoided certain topics altogether. how I mentally rehearsed explanations I hoped I'd never need to give. It was exhausting in a quiet way. Not overwhelming, just constant. The worst part wasn't the guilt. It was the awareness. I knew that if he ever found out on his own, it would hurt more than if I had just told him. Not because of the secret itself, but because of the time, the years of silence, the realization that I had been living alongside him while holding something back. And yet, even knowing that, I still didn't speak. Because by then, telling the truth didn't feel like honesty anymore. It felt like disruption, like pulling a thread, and not knowing how much would unravel once I did. So I stayed quiet, and with every day that passed, the silence felt more intentional, and harder to justify as innocent. At this point, was I still protecting him? Or had I crossed into protecting myself from the consequences of being honest? Do you think I crossed a line here? There's a moment when a secret stops being passive and starts influencing your behavior. I didn't notice it right away, but looking back, that's exactly what happened to me. It wasn't one big change. It was a series of small adjustments that slowly became my new normal. I started paying attention to things I never used to think about. What time I mentioned certain events, how casually I spoke about my day, which details I shared without hesitation, and which ones I instinctively filtered out. Not because he was interrogating me, he wasn't, but because I had become hyper-aware of how easily a conversation could drift into territory I wasn't prepared to navigate honestly. What scared me most was how natural it began to feel. I didn't feel like I was deceiving him. I felt like I was managing information, like I was being careful. I was doing something adults do when they understand that not every truth needs to be spoken out loud. That's how I justified it. At least. There were moments when he would talk about trust, not in a suspicious way, but in that comfortable, reassuring tone couples develop over time. Comments about how open we were with each other, how we never hid things, how communication was one of our strengths. Each time, I felt a subtle tightening inside me. Not panic. Not shame, just a quiet awareness that I was standing on ground that wasn't as solid as it appeared. And still, I said nothing. I told myself that honesty isn't just about telling the truth. It's about timing, about intention, about weighing the impact of your words. I convinced myself that bringing this up now would only create confusion, or worse, distrust, over something that didn't fundamentally change how I felt about him. But the truth is, I had started to change, not in how I treated him, not in how committed I was to the relationship, but in how I related to myself. I became someone who calculated, someone who paused before speaking, not to be thoughtful, but to be strategic. And that realization unsettled me more than the secret itself. There were nights I lay awake replaying conversations in my head, not because anything had gone wrong, but because I was mentally checking whether I had said too much or too little, whether I had left gaps, whether I had accidentally implied something I'd have to explain later. I remember one specific moment that stuck with me. We were sitting on the couch, talking about something unrelated, when he asked a question that brushed uncomfortably close to the truth. It wasn't direct. It wasn't suspicious. It was casual, the kind of question that usually doesn't require any mental preparation. I answered him smoothly. Too smoothly. The words came out easily, confidently, as if I had rehearsed them, which, in a way, I had. And he accepted the answer without hesitation. He trusted me. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt heavy, because in that moment, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit before. The secret wasn't just something I was carrying anymore. It was something I was actively protecting. And once you reach that point, it's hard to pretend you're still being neutral. Hard to claim you're just waiting for the right time. Hard to believe you're doing this for someone else. I started wondering whether the real reason I hadn't spoken wasn't about protecting him at all, but about protecting the version of myself he believed in. The version that hadn't made complicated choices. The version that hadn't decided, alone, what he could and couldn't handle knowing. And that's when a new question began to form in my mind. One I couldn't push away as easily as the others. If the truth came out later, would it hurt because of what it was, or because of how long I chose to keep it hidden? Was I wrong for letting the silence go on this long? What surprised me most was how quickly the silence became something I actively maintained, rather than something I simply lived with. At first, it had felt temporary, like a pause, a delay, but by then, it had turned into a pattern. I noticed how my mind began working ahead of conversations instead of staying present in them. I wasn't just listening anymore. I was anticipating, predicting where things could go, mentally rerouting topics before they reached places that felt too close to the truth. That was when I realized how much energy it was taking, not in a dramatic, exhausting way, more like a constant background noise I couldn't turn off. A low-level awareness that followed me through normal moments. Grocery shopping, casual dinners, small talks about our days. Nothing was wrong on the surface, but internally, I was always adjusting. What made it harder was that he hadn't changed at all. He was still open, still affectionate, still honest in the way people are when they don't feel the need to guard themselves. And every time he shared something vulnerable with me, I felt the imbalance more clearly. There were moments when I almost welcomed a confrontation, not because I wanted to fight, but because it would have forced the issue. It would have taken the choice out of my hands. But nothing happened. Life continued as usual. I told myself that if the silence was truly harmful, I would feel it more sharply, that guilt would be louder, that my conscience would demand action. Instead, what I felt was something quieter, a slow distancing from my own instincts. I stopped asking myself whether I should tell him. I started asking whether I could. Could I explain it in a way that made sense? Could I control how it would be interpreted? Could I prevent it from becoming something bigger than it was? Those questions were revealing, even if I didn't want to acknowledge it at the time. Because once your focus shifts from honesty to damage control, something fundamental has already changed. I remember thinking how strange it was that the relationship still felt stable, how everything externally suggested that things were fine. Friends saw us as solid. Family saw us as consistent. Even I could have described us that way, if someone asked. And yet, I knew that stability was partially built on something incomplete. Not false, just unfinished. There was a moment when I caught myself feeling relieved after a conversation ended without touching the secret. That feeling scared me more than anything else, because relief meant I had started seeing silence as a success. I had crossed from waiting for the right time into hoping the time would never come. That realization forced me to confront an uncomfortable thought. Maybe I wasn't afraid of hurting him anymore. Maybe I was afraid of losing control over the narrative. As long as the truth stayed with me, I could shape it. I could minimize it. I could convince myself it wasn't as serious as it might sound out loud. Once spoken, it would no longer belong only to me. And that scared me. I started wondering whether relationships break because of secrets themselves, or because of the power imbalance they create. Because one person knows something the other doesn't. Because one person gets to decide what reality looks like for both. That thought lingered with me longer than I wanted to admit, because I had never seen myself as someone who controlled or manipulated. And yet, in choosing silence repeatedly, I was doing exactly that. Quietly, unintentionally, but consistently. I wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere along the way, silence stopped feeling neutral. It started feeling like a choice with consequences I could no longer ignore. At this point, was I still protecting the relationship, or was I shaping it without his consent? Do you think silence can become a form of control? By the time I realized the silence had become intentional, I also realized something else. It had started to influence how I interpreted his reactions. Every question felt heavier than it used to. As I listened different, I wasn't hearing curiosity anymore. I was hearing potential consequences. I began reading between lines that weren't there. A pause in his response felt loaded. A follow-up question felt suspicious, even when it wasn't. And the most unsettling part was knowing that none of this was coming from him. It was coming from me. There were moments when I almost felt irritated, not at him, but at the situation, at how something I considered minor had slowly taken up so much space in my head, at how I couldn't relax fully anymore, even in moments that were meant to feel easy. One evening stands out more clearly than the others. We were talking about trust, not because of us, but because of a story someone had told us earlier that day. Another couple, another situation. Something distant and hypothetical. He said something simple, something neutral, about how honesty matters more than perfection, about how he'd rather know uncomfortable truths than live with a false sense of security. I nodded. I agreed. Out loud, I even reinforced his point. Inside, I felt exposed, not because he knew anything, but because he was unknowingly describing the exact line I had been walking around for years. And in that moment, I understood how fragile my position really was. If honesty mattered more than comfort, what did my silence say about me? If transparency was a shared value, why had I exempted myself from it? I remember thinking that maybe the reason I hadn't spoken yet wasn't because I was unsure, but because I already knew how he would feel. And that realization forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes we don't avoid honesty because we're confused. We avoid it because we're too clear on the outcome. The secret had given me a sense of control, not over him, but over the version of the relationship we were living in. As long as I stayed silent, nothing had to change. No conversations, no recalibration, no risk of redefining trust. But that control came at a cost. I started feeling disconnected in subtle ways. Not distant, just slightly out of sync. As if I was reacting to a reality he wasn't aware of. As if I was always one step ahead emotionally, carrying information he didn't have access to. And that imbalance began to feel wrong. There were moments when I wanted to tell him not because I felt guilty, but because I wanted relief, because I was tired of managing something alone, tired of being the only one who knew what was really at stake. But every time I got close to bringing it up, a new thought stopped me. What if telling the truth didn't bring clarity? What if it only created damage that couldn't be undone? What if the honesty I was considering wasn't brave, just selfish? I wondered whether confessing now would be about integrity, or about easing my own discomfort at the expense of his peace of mind. That question haunted me more than the secret itself, because it meant that silence and honesty were no longer clearly right or wrong. They were competing forms of self-interest, each justified in its own way. And somewhere between those two choices, I felt stuck, aware that not choosing was still a choice, and that time was quietly making it for me. If telling the truth now would only hurt him, was I wrong for continuing to protect him from it? What would you have done in my place? What I didn't expect was how the silence would start changing the way I saw our relationship itself. Not in big, obvious ways. There were no fights, no cold distance, no dramatic shifts in how we treated each other. Everything still looked solid. But internally, I began experiencing our connection through a different lens, one shaped by what he didn't know. I noticed it most during moments that were supposed to feel intimate. Not physical intimacy, but emotional closeness. Late-night conversations, quiet mornings, those moments where you feel seen, understood, and safe with someone. That sense of safety started to feel uneven. He was showing up fully, unfiltered, unprotected, and I wasn't. That imbalance weighed on me more than I wanted to admit. I started questioning whether emotional intimacy can truly exist when one person is withholding a version of reality. Not lying, but editing, curating, deciding, alone, what the other person is allowed to see. And once that thought entered my mind, I couldn't push it away. There were days when I felt closer to him than ever, and that scared me, because the closer we felt, the more wrong the silence seemed. As if I were accepting his openness while offering something slightly incomplete in return. I began to wonder if trust isn't just about believing your partner won't hurt you, but about knowing they're not quietly deciding what you can handle. That idea made me deeply uncomfortable, because I had always seen myself as fair, considerate, someone who valued equality in a relationship. Yet here I was, holding information that directly affected the emotional ground we were standing on, and making decisions about it without his input. There were moments when I imagined telling him, not the confrontation, but the aftermath, the look on his face, the questions I wouldn't be able to answer cleanly, the silence that would follow. And I realized something important. I wasn't afraid of his reaction. I was afraid of the shift, of losing the version of us that existed before the truth entered the room. Because once spoken, Nothing would be neutral anymore, even if he chose to forgive. Even if he chose to understand, something would be different. That realization led me to a disturbing question. Was I preserving the relationship, or preserving a version of it that only existed because of what he didn't know? At the same time, staying silent was slowly changing me. I became more guarded, less spontaneous, more aware of myself in moments where I used to feel natural. It wasn't obvious to anyone else, but I felt it. And that internal shift made me realize how easy it is to convince yourself you're protecting someone, when what you're really protecting is stability, comfort, predictability. I started to see how silence can be seductive, not because it's easy, but because it postpones discomfort. It allows you to live in a version of reality where consequences feel theoretical instead of real. But time has a way of making things real whether you're ready or not. I began noticing how often I thought about the future, not with excitement, but with calculation. How every plan felt conditional. How every long-term conversation carried an unspoken asterisk, as if part of me knew that whatever future we were building wasn't fully informed. And that thought haunted me. Because if I truly believed in us, why wasn't I willing to let the truth exist alongside that belief? Why did honesty feel like a threat instead of a foundation? By then, I understood something I hadn't before. The silence had stopped being about a single secret. It had become a test of how much truth a relationship can withstand, and of how much responsibility one person should have in deciding that alone. If a relationship is built on shared reality, was I slowly undermining ours by keeping part of it to myself? Do you think emotional intimacy can survive this kind of silence? What changed wasn't a discovery. It wasn't a confrontation. It was a moment of clarity I hadn't planned for. I realized the silence had started influencing my choices about the future. Not openly, not in ways I could easily explain, but subtly, in how cautious I became when we talked about long-term plans, where we'd live, what we wanted next, how much certainty we had about us. I noticed myself hesitating in conversations that used to feel natural. Not because I didn't want those things, but because I wasn't sure I had the right to commit to them without full honesty. That was a hard thought to sit with. Because from his perspective, nothing had changed. He still spoke with confidence, with trust, with the assumption that we were operating from the same information, and I wasn't. That imbalance became impossible to ignore. I remember one night when he talked about a decision he was making that directly involved both of us. It wasn't small. It wasn't casual. It was something that would shape our next few years. As he spoke, all I could think was how unfair it felt that he was choosing with certainty, while I was silently holding something that could change everything. That's when the guilt sharpened. Not because of the secret itself, but because of timing. Because of the realization that my silence wasn't just about the past anymore. It was actively shaping our future. I started asking myself questions I hadn't allowed before. What if the truth came out later? After bigger commitments were made? After deeper roots were set? Would my silence then feel like protection? Or like deception? I began to see how time doesn't neutralize secrets. It compounds them. The longer I waited, the more responsibility I carried for the choices we were making together, choices he believed were fully informed, and that weight became heavier than the fear of speaking. Still, I didn't rush into honesty. Instead, I found myself delaying decisions, asking for more time, suggesting we slow down without explaining why. He noticed, not in an accusatory way, but with concern. He asked me if something was wrong. That question lingered longer than any others had before, because it wasn't abstract. It wasn't philosophical. It was direct, and for the first time, silence felt less like an option and more like avoidance. I gave him a partial truth, not a lie, but not the whole picture either. I told him I was feeling overwhelmed, that I needed time to think, that I wanted to make sure we were making decisions for the right reasons. All of that was true. What I didn't say was why. He accepted my explanation, respected it, trusted it, and that trust cut deeper than suspicion ever could have, because it forced me to confront the reality of what I was doing. I was allowing him to adjust his life based on an incomplete understanding of mine. That night, I couldn't sleep, not because I was afraid of losing him, but because I realized how close I was to crossing a line I had once promised myself I never would. The line where silence stops being passive. The line where it becomes an active choice to let someone build a future without all the pieces. And once you reach that point, there's no neutral ground left. You either speak, or you accept responsibility for everything that follows. I knew then that whatever I chose next would change things. Not dramatically, not immediately, but permanently. And for the first time in years, I felt like time was no longer on my side. If you realize your silence is shaping someone else's future, do you still have the right to keep it? Was I wrong for not telling him everything at that moment? After that night, I stopped pretending this was something I could think my way out of. For years, I had treated the silence like a problem of timing, something that could be solved by choosing the right moment, the right words, the right context. But now I understood that timing was no longer the issue. The issue was courage, not the dramatic kind, not the kind people admire from the outside, but the quiet courage it takes to risk changing how someone sees you. Once I admitted that to myself, everything felt heavier. Every interaction carried a sense of urgency I couldn't ignore anymore. Every shared plan felt provisional. Every expression of trust felt like something I was borrowing rather than earning. I started noticing how often he referenced us in a future sense, not carelessly, but with confidence, as if it was a given, as if the foundation beneath us was stable and complete. And that's when the guilt shifted again. It wasn't just about what I hadn't said. It was about what I was allowing him to assume. There's a difference between lying about the past and allowing someone to make irreversible decisions without all the information. I hadn't crossed the first line, but I was dangerously close to the second. I remember standing in the kitchen one morning, watching him talk about something ordinary, his day, his plans, nothing important, and I felt this overwhelming sense of distance, even though he was right there. Not emotional distance, ethical distance. I knew something he didn't, and that knowledge had started placing me in a position of quiet authority over the relationship, deciding when, if ever, reality would fully exist for both of us. That realization was unsettling, because I had never wanted that kind of power. I began rehearsing the conversation in my head again, but this time it felt different, less hypothetical, more urgent. I imagined telling him and watching the shift happen in real time, the moment where his understanding of the past would realign, where trust wouldn't necessarily disappear, but would have to be rebuilt around a new truth. I also imagined choosing not to tell him, letting life move forward as it was, accepting the secret as something I would simply carry forever, convincing myself that some truths expire with time. But that option no longer felt neutral. It felt like a decision with consequences I could already see forming. I noticed how my patience had shortened, how small disagreements felt heavier, how my reactions were no longer proportional to the moment, because they were connected to something deeper. I was tired, not of the relationship, not of him. I was tired of being the only one fully aware of the emotional stakes. One evening, he asked me again if something was wrong, not insistently, not suspiciously, just gently, and for the first time, I almost told him. The words sat right at the edge of my throat, not polished, not rehearsed, just honest. But then I saw the look on his face, calm, open, trusting, and fear stopped me. Not fear of losing him, fear of becoming someone different in his eyes. I realized then how deeply tied my silence had become to my identity, to who I believed I was in the relationship, to the version of myself I wanted to be seen as. And that terrified me, because it meant the choice wasn't just about protecting him anymore, it was about protecting me. My image, my intentions, my self-concept. Once I acknowledged that, I knew I was running out of room. Either I would speak and accept whatever followed, or I would remain silent and accept responsibility for shaping a shared future on incomplete truth. And that responsibility was starting to feel unbearable. I went to bed that night knowing something had shifted, not externally, not visibly, but internally. I had crossed into a space where not deciding felt worse than deciding, And I knew that whatever came next would no longer be theoretical. If you realize your silence is no longer protecting anyone, but preserving your own comfort, do you still have the right to keep it? What would you have done next? What finally pushed me to the edge wasn't a discovery or an ultimatum. It was the realization that I was running out of honest versions of myself. For a long time, I had believed silence was something I could live with indefinitely, that I could compartmentalize it, keep it separate from the rest of my life. But by then, it had started bleeding into everything: my reactions, my decisions, my sense of integrity. I began to feel like I was constantly negotiating with myself, not about whether I loved him. That part was never in question, but about whether love justified choosing his reality for him. I caught myself wondering how I would feel if the roles were reversed, if I found out years later that he had known something significant, not devastating, not explosive, and still chose to let me plan, commit, and trust without it. I didn't like the answer. That thought stayed with me longer than any justification I had created, because it forced me to confront the one thing I had avoided admitting. This wasn't about whether the truth would hurt. It was about consent, about whether he had the right to make choices with full awareness, even if that awareness caused discomfort, and whether I had taken that right away by staying silent. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that my silence had created an uneven playing field. I wasn't just protecting a secret. I was holding information that directly affected how secure our relationship felt, and that meant I was no longer just reacting to the relationship. I was shaping it. That realization made it impossible to continue pretending I was neutral. I remember sitting alone one afternoon, thinking about all the opportunities I had missed to be honest. Not dramatic opportunities, not moments of crisis, just normal moments where truth could have existed quietly and naturally, if I had let it. Each one felt heavier in hindsight. I started imagining the conversation again, but this time without trying to control the outcome. No explanations designed to soften the impact, no framing meant to protect my image. Just the truth, stated plainly. That version scared me more than any other, because I knew that once spoken, I wouldn't get to decide what it meant anymore. He would, and that loss of control felt terrifying. There was a night shortly after when he said something that stayed with me. Not about trust, not about honesty, about partnership. He talked about how important it was to feel like you're choosing life together, not just moving alongside each other. How shared decisions require shared understanding. He wasn't talking about me. He wasn't hinting. He wasn't suspicious. And yet, it felt like the clearest mirror I had been shown in years. That night, I realized something irreversible. Even if I never told him, the relationship had already changed, because I had changed. I was no longer fully present in the partnership. I was managing it. And I didn't want to be that person. But wanting something and doing it are very different things. I stood at the edge of the decision for days. Not dramatic days, quiet ones. I rehearsed. I stopped rehearsing. I convinced myself it could wait. I convinced myself it couldn't. And then I reached a point where neither option felt clean. If I told him, I risked hurting him and altering everything we had built. If I didn't, I accepted responsibility for every future choice made under incomplete truth. There was no version of this where I walked away without consequences. That's when I understood that silence had given me the illusion of safety, but honesty would force accountability, and I wasn't sure which one I was ready to live with. I knew the next step would define not just our relationship, but the kind of partner I was willing to be. And for the first time, I couldn't delay it any longer. If both honesty and silence carry consequences, how do you decide which one you're responsible for? Do you think waiting this long made the truth harder to justify? I didn't choose honesty because it felt brave. I chose it because silence had stopped feeling livable. There was no perfect moment, no calm setup, no speech I practiced that finally sounded right. I told him on an ordinary day, in an ordinary moment, because I realized waiting for the right time was just another way of avoiding responsibility. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't soften it. I didn't frame it as something noble. I told him what I had kept to myself, and I told him how long I had kept it. What followed wasn't anger in the way people expect. There was no shouting. No immediate accusations. There was confusion, the kind that comes when someone has to rearrange their understanding of the past, when memories don't disappear, but shift. He asked questions I didn't have clean answers for. Not because I didn't want to answer, but because some choices don't come with explanations that feel satisfying in hindsight. I told him the truth about why I stayed silent, not just the part about protection, but the part about fear, about control, about how silence slowly became easier than honesty. That was the hardest part to admit, because it meant acknowledging that, at some point, my silence wasn't just about sparing him pain, it was about sparing myself discomfort. He listened, and that, in many ways, was worse than anger. He told me he didn't know what to feel yet, that the secret itself wasn't what hurt the most. It was realizing that I had carried it alone for so long, deciding, without him, what he deserved to know. That sentence stayed with me, because it confirmed what I had been afraid of all along. The damage wasn't in the truth. It was in the imbalance it created. We didn't resolve everything that day. There was no immediate clarity, no clean resolution. Trust doesn't break all at once, and it doesn't rebuild that way either. What changed was the ground we stood on. The relationship didn't end, but it didn't stay the same. There were difficult conversations after that, awkward silences, moments of doubt that surfaced in places they never had before. And there were moments of relief, too. Not relief because everything was okay, but because I was no longer carrying something alone. I learned something uncomfortable through all of this. Silence can feel protective, but it often delays pain instead of preventing it. And when that pain finally arrives, it carries the weight of time with it. I don't regret telling the truth, but I do regret how long it took me to accept that honesty isn't just about intention. It's about timing and consent. Love doesn't give us the right to decide what reality someone else gets to live in. Even when our intentions are good, even when the truth is complicated. I don't know what the long-term outcome will be. Some days feel closer, some days feel fragile. But I do know this. I would rather face uncertainty with honesty than certainty built on silence, because the cost of carrying something alone for years isn't just guilt. It's slowly becoming someone you don't fully recognize. And that, for me, was the real risk. Do you think I made the right choice in the end? If you enjoy real, thought-provoking Reddit-style stories, subscribe to the channel for more.